Since World War II, the United States of America has been involved in more foreign conflicts than any other nation. Presidents of both political parties have told us the United States must umpire the world's conflicts, and that if the U.S. does not do this job, the world will not be safe.
The international system that was set up at the end of World War II is not functioning as well as it should. I think that the world is fragile.
If the United States steps back from the historic role we played since World War II, the world will come apart at the seams.
Yet the costs of leadership are high. In a world of rich nations, why does the U.S. have to shoulder this burden, mostly alone?
We've made it very difficult for other countries to play a role because they don't see the need to. They know that we'll do it.
American allies are very, very adept at telling the Americans arguments as to why the Americans must do this project. If you don't do it, no one will do it, and the world will end.
Why are we acting as the world's policemen? And I think the American public really would like to have an answer to that question.
In this hour, we will examine the history and the future of America's military commitments abroad. U.S. troops have been coming home for generations. Home from deployments abroad, home from war. Some reunions are joyful. Others are filled with sorrow. How did the security of the entire globe become the responsibility of the United States?
Well, I think that the part that's interesting about being the U.S., frankly, is you're damned if you do or damned if you don't.
I know the American people must ask, at the end of the Cold War, when we so spectacularly succeeded and the Soviet Union collapsed and all of these great new democracies were born, why do we have to keep going?
Elizabeth Cobbs is a professor and author who's researched this tangled question. For 25 years, she has taught the history of U.S. foreign relations at universities in America and abroad. She studied policy and talked with those who made it.
Chinese feel that they have been maligned and disrespected.
She asked the question, if democracy is spread all around the world, why do we have to keep defending it? Why do we volunteer when other democracies don't?
I've asked this question of myself and others for many decades. So I began to think that there was a connection between the way that we operate at home, the way we deal with relations between the states, and how we deal with foreign countries. And that reminded me of a word that I found in the Federalist Papers. It was the word umpire. And that made me think about baseball.
You can't play baseball without umpires. They make the calls. They decide what's foul and what's fair, who's safe and who's out.
The founders understood that politics operated a lot like team sports. The 13 states were very, very different from one another, and it could be a nightmare to get them to play together. And so what they devised when they wrote up the Constitution was a federal umpire to keep the states cooperating, to prevent war between them, to take down tariff walls between them, to impose a kind of common citizenship.
The states were not always willing to reach that common compromise or to accede to the rules, and so that's why an umpire plays a crucial role in the early days of the Republic.
This had never really been tried before in world history. The idea of taking states and putting them together without one of them trying to clobber or conquer or rule over the others, but rather using a kind of cooperative go-between, an umpire, to keep peace among them.
The system wasn't perfect. The Civil War was the bloodiest conflict in our nation's history. But most problems were resolved without violence. With an effective federal umpire and big protective oceans, the U.S. grew strong. By 1890, the United States enjoyed domestic peace and the world's largest economy. War-torn Europe was different. It had no enforcer of common rules and no common market. There, bloody conflicts repeatedly surfaced.
The last thing the founders wanted was to get drawn into Europe's continual conflicts. And so they came up with three basic principles of American foreign policy that guided foreign policy for 150 years. The first rule of American foreign policy was often called Washington's Great Rule, and it was the idea that the United States would always be a neutral nation.
The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible.
He said that we should have economic and trade relations with countries, but we should try to avoid becoming drawn into their politics.
We were neutral. We were reflexively neutral. This is an old reflex. Jefferson and Madison had done it too in the Napoleonic era. The United States entered into treaties throughout the 19th century, but no military alliances.
The United States not only wanted no military alliances, they wanted no military. And this was the second founding principle of the United States: no standing army. They didn't want a standing army because they believed that it always ate away the resources of any country, and that it was always a threat to liberty. It's what kings had used to control the people.
The idea was that we would not have a large army. It could be raised quickly. Men would pull the musket down from over the fireplace, and they would go off and do their job, then return there.
We certainly disarmed after the Revolutionary War. We disbanded the Union and Confederate forces, for that matter, after the Civil War. Samuel Adams said, "A standing army will always be a danger to the liberties of the people."
This was very different from European countries, which maintained large armies.
The Napoleonic Wars define the initial phase of an era in the history of warfare where big industrial states relied on mass conscription of their young male citizens. And the United States, for almost that entire period, is the big outlier. It has no large-scale standing force.
There was a third founding principle of American foreign policy, and this was the idea that the United States should never intervene in other people's problems, that they should solve them themselves. John Quincy Adams best articulated this on July 4th, 1821.
America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher of freedom to everyone, but she is the vindicator only of her own.
This idea that if the United States goes abroad and fights on behalf of others, we will be drawn into their conflicts, and their conflicts become our own. And over time, that will sap not only our strength, but our values, our culture, what it is that is appealing to others that they wish to emulate.
For the first 150 years of American foreign policy, we operated on three principles: neutrality, non-intervention, and no standing army. Sometimes there were military crises, but we responded in our own way and on our own terms, all the way through World War I.
President Wilson declared neutrality 2 weeks after the war began in 1914. America stayed on the sidelines for nearly 3 years. But the catastrophic war dragged on. Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare to cut off supplies to its enemies. Neutrality frayed. American merchant ships were sunk. The U.S. finally stepped up to the plate in 1917. Even then, Wilson made clear that he wanted no part of a formal alliance.
Wilson, again honoring the old isolationist traditions of his republic, refused to make the United States a formal treaty-obligated ally of his comrades in arms. The United States was going to fight alongside them, but not exactly with them.
When the war ended, America brought every soldier home and reduced its military by 90%. The U.S. even hosted the world's first disarmament conference to prevent future wars. The major powers agreed to destroy their own battleships. Army bombers sank the USS Virginia off the coast of Cape Hatteras on a calm morning in 1923.
So after World War I, the United States did what it had always done, which was to return to its founding principles. The 1920s was a very sunny decade, and the United States could afford to ignore problems abroad. Also, it had its own traditions, which was a tradition of neutrality and not getting involved in other people's problems.
Then, almost overnight, everything changed. Stocks crashed. The Great Depression swept the world.
In the Great Depression, countries like Japan, Germany, and Italy, their leaders told their people that the only way they could restore prosperity was through conquest. And so Italy attacked North Africa. Japan attacked China. Germany conquered almost all of Western Europe. And the basis of this was the idea that only through conquest could you really get the resources you needed. Now, Americans, again, more than ever wanted to stay as far away from that as possible.
I think that this country should heed the advice of its first president and avoid all foreign entanglements.
Let Europe fight our own battles. They mean nothing to us.
I think we should stay out of it entirely.
Congress passed 5 neutrality laws, each stricter than the next. But neutrality frayed again as the war got closer and closer to home. Britain alone stood up to Hitler.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender.
In a last-ditch effort to stay out of the fight and avert another world war, President Roosevelt sent letters to Hitler and Mussolini, asking them to respect the independence and sovereignty of 33 countries. To Adolf Hitler, this message was a huge joke. He recited the 33 names to the Reichstag.
Romanian, Yugoslavian, Rusland,
from Sweden and Denmark down to Iraq and Palestine. The arrogant Nazis merely laughed. This was their only answer to Roosevelt. At the time, the U.S. Army ranked 19th in size in the world, behind Portugal. Congress reluctantly approved a peacetime draft. Our military had so few weapons that some GIs trained with wooden guns and pretend tanks. They substituted bags of flour for bombs. When Japan bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and Germany declared war on the U.S., America could remain neutral no longer.
Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
British Prime Minister Winston Churchill said he went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. American military help was on the way. Resistance fighters in occupied France took courage as well.
I grew up with a mother who got into the underground resistance movement when she was 19. She got arrested. She was able to escape and welcome the arrival of the American troops just west of Paris. And my mother always told me that when things really look bad, really, there is America.
Working together, the Allies gradually won the war and began to talk about how to win the peace, how to break the cycle of repeated wars.
Some rather brilliant people looked back, and what did they see? They saw 2 world wars. 70 million people were killed.
The World War II generation looked around and said, it's a pretty crummy world. We've just fought a Second World War in 20 years. We have no way of really settling issues short of warfare. So they established the United Nations. They went to Bretton Woods and came up with a monetary system.
Delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt to the first major world financial meeting since the London Conference of 1933, to be discussed are plans for the stabilization of world currencies.
So they created an architecture that had the purpose of creating a more peaceful world where part of the formula was that everybody was succeeding economically. So the premise was that we were more secure in a world where there was less potential for sort of conflict.
The idea behind the United Nations was that of economic and political cooperation. And the United States had no notion at all of leaving its military behind. And so, in fact, the assumption was that we would do what we had done after every other single war, which is to bring our military home.
Maintaining a large ground force occupying Europe and trying to straighten out all the centuries of European problems and so on was not something that they could easily imagine, especially Roosevelt, and to a certain degree Truman as well, did not anticipate a globe-girdling military establishment.
But the world was not stable. Shell-shocked countries in Europe and Asia did not trust their former enemies. In addition, the Soviet Union became increasingly aggressive, setting up police states on its western borders and pressuring Turkey to the south. When a communist-backed civil war broke out next door in Greece, London called Washington for help.
Britain was a kind of linchpin in southern Europe, and they were there protecting the peace. And what happened is they called up Washington and said, we're broke. We can't do this anymore. We are pulling out. And if you want Greece not to fall, and which of course if Greece fell, then Italy could fall, and if Italy fell, then France could fall. And this kind of effect could cascade. And so the United States was put on notice that if it didn't want a return to an incredibly destabilizing war, that it would have to do something. So what happened is that Truman did something he never expected to do, which was to go back to the Congress and say, we have to return to Europe.
Alarmed at the rapid expansion of totalitarian interests in Europe and Asia, President Truman addresses a joint session of Congress on our changing foreign policy.
The very existence of the Greek state is today threatened by the terrorist activities of several thousand armed men led by communists. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the west as well as to the east. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
And this is when the Cold War really started. And it not only the Cold War started, but the United States agreed that it would take leadership in that war. And so 1947 is the key year in American history. That's the year at which George Washington's Great Rule was replaced by the Truman Doctrine. And the idea was not only that the United States would take leadership in the Cold War, but that it would really step up to the plate. And this has defined American history ever since. Republicans, Democrats, every American president since 1947 has followed the Truman Doctrine.
And the conduct of U.S. foreign policy after World War II was informed by our experience, our history as the umpire between the states in our early days. The one crucial difference, though, is that there was no formal grant of authority to the U.S. government to behave as the federal government did to the states.
Was the fear well-founded in the Cold War? Yes, I believe it was. Was it a relatively simple argument in the Cold War? Yes, I believe it was. There was a single focus, there was one state, and that state had a lot of capability.
The Soviet Union flexed its growing military power in a blockade of Berlin, trying to force its former allies out of Germany. West Europeans began to fear for their own safety once again and urged the United States to help form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to keep the peace regionally.
We will now proceed with the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty.
NATO was America's very first permanent armed alliance.
The old joke about NATO was that it had three purposes: to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. And in its essence, it did its job.
This four-pointed star is the emblem of NATO.
The jackpot question is, why did the economic reconstruction of Europe also yield a military alliance in NATO, which became the kind of the point of the spear, you might say, for what some people call the militarization of American diplomacy ever since. That we've made a much bigger bet on our military as an instrument of policy since World War II than I think the architects of World War II fully understood or foresaw.
Following NATO, America gradually signed defense alliances with countries around the world. Militaristic Germany and Japan became peaceful democracies. Encouraged by the U.S., they changed their focus from territorial conquest to economic development. As historian Joseph Jaffe has written, the Germans found it was more profitable to polish their BMWs than their jackboots.
All of Western Europe benefited enormously by the American sponsor order because for the first time in its bloody history, 500 years of war, there was suddenly a player in the game and who could protect each against the other. So this grand experiment of European integration, where these arch enemies, France and Germany, suddenly link hands, would not have been possible without Big Brother standing behind them, assuring each against the risks of cooperation.
Commerce followed where that stability was imposed by the Americans.
During the years of the Truman Doctrine, nation-states gradually replaced empires. The UN grew from 51 to nearly 200 countries.
What happened with the UN was that every country in the world signed on to the premise that a country deserved the right to exist, that every country had the right to exist, and that was absolutely revolutionary in all world history.
The great lesson of American foreign policy in the last 70 years is that we've created, in a sense, these global norms, these global laws that basically most countries adhere to. I mean, that's the great accomplishment. Countries don't see much purpose in seizing territory from other countries.
We had a security and economic commons. And it was put there with a lot of leadership from the United States. That doesn't mean we told people, here's this and this. But when the United States comes with ideas and resources in a problem-solving way, there's a response.
Economists describe the second half of the 20th century as the golden age. Trade boomed. Gradually, even communist countries came to accept free markets and world cooperation as a faster, safer route to prosperity than dominating their neighbors. The Berlin Wall fell.
The moment Berliners have waited 28 years for.
The Cold War ended.
So when the Cold War ended, the question became, should the United States continue to exercise the kind of emergency role it had been playing for 70 years? How can you normalize this world security system? And is it time to share the burden?
The Truman Doctrine guided American foreign policy from the end of World War II into the 1990s. And since 1991, the demise of the Soviet Union and the ending of the Cold War, the United States has really wrestled with the question of what the next overarching doctrine will be. The United States hasn't really come to terms with developing a doctrine for the long term. It's a fair question to say, do we need more burden sharing?
Europe as an economy is about the same size as the United States. So it's not reasonable to have one of them providing the lion's share of the basic investment in security and the other one sort of free riding on it.
It's pretty obvious that the Europeans don't do enough.
95% of all foreign soldiers and sailors, airmen, Marines in the world deployed outside of their countries, they're Americans.
When it comes to world security, the United States supplies the cash, equipment, and lives.
American leadership thought it would be front-loaded with a lot of American aid to get things up and running, and then the Europeans would largely run the show for themselves. That hope has gone absolutely unfulfilled for now 3 generations, and there's been a constant badgering of the Europeans over many years to pay their fair share.
Very frustrating for anybody in our national security community to be working with NATO. We're spending 4.5% of our GDP on defense, and a vast majority of our allies in NATO are spending 2%, less than 2%, 1%.
Every year this defense secretary gives a speech to Brussels, says contribute more, and every year the European defense ministers will clap and they'll sort of say, yes, that's a great point, and they won't do it. If we step back, will the Europeans actually increase their military contribution to NATO? They might. They will if they see themselves as facing a threat. But that's the big point. They don't see themselves facing a threat. There's a reason they don't spend money in their military, because they know they live in a region of great peace and security. And they have a great ally in the United States who will help defend them when they need to be defended, if that ever happens.
Within NATO, that there is an interplay between America saying, okay, we're still going to be there, but hey, it costs too much. And the Europeans should cover basically more of the costs.
We have to be very blunt with other countries. We cannot carry the full burden for this, and America has no moral obligation to do the impossible. If what we're going to do is break the bank of every American taxpayer, if what we're going to do is put our boys in the mud to do what they need to also have their boys doing alongside us, then this is something that can't be sustained. It's not sustainable. It's not manly for their countries not to man up and carry their own share.
Their economies have benefited from the fact that they don't have to pay for national defense. We've been doing it since '46. So that's a long time. Why would you suddenly expect the Germans and the Italians to say, "Oh, forget that. Let's pay now"? I just don't see it. I don't see any European country that would be prepared to sacrifice any pension payments to increase defense. And their view is we can do it.
There was real hope and excitement at the end of the Cold War that the United States could begin to stand down and that the Europeans would take upon themselves their own security. And the first test was the breakup of Yugoslavia, the Balkans. And when a terrible civil war broke out that resulted in the absolute slaughter of Muslim civilians, all different kinds of people, ethnic cleansing. What happened in the Balkans was that the Europeans sent witnesses and advisors, but they were not willing to use force. They were not really willing to put their men in harm's way.
When President Clinton came into office, Bosnia was going on. And the idea was that it was in Europe, the Europeans should deal with Bosnia. Why should we get involved in it? The first President Bush had said he wanted to see a Europe that was whole and free and at peace. One of my predecessors, Secretary Baker, had kind of indicated, why should the U.S. do this? We would be getting reports about the ethnic cleansing and people being displaced and ravaged and women being raped and terrible horrors going on all over the place. And one after another, people would come to me, different ambassadors, and say, why aren't you people doing something? Because ultimately, we needed to deal with what was unacceptable.
The statute of limitations on war crimes does not run out, and Mr. Carriage...
It would have been better if the Europeans had done it, but they weren't doing it.
Back in the 90s, I did a series of lecture tours of Germany. This was when the Balkans were coming apart. I remember in one forum where a German asked me, he said, what is the United States going to do about what's going on in Kosovo? I said, a lot of people in the United States want to know, what are you going to do? He said, it's in your backyard. Why are you looking to us across the ocean to solve your problem?
We have been touched by tragedy.
Yet President Clinton was ultimately forced to intervene in the Balkans. He called the United States the indispensable nation.
America stands alone as the world's indispensable nation.
Historically, Americans have always valued self-reliance. It's one of our fundamental values. And we've created a situation in which Europeans and other allies are dependent on us. And that's not healthy for anybody.
We have accumulated so much global power to ourselves that we've made it very difficult for other countries to play a role because they don't see the need to. They know that we'll do it. So I think this indispensable nation talk ends up driving a foreign policy of constant activity and also of defining your interests in the broadest manner imaginable.
The notion of the indispensable nation is fraught in many, many respects. It conveys the notion to others that they don't have to pull up their socks and handle their own problems, right? So, well, you're right, you are indispensable. Come on over here and be indispensable for me, and I can divert another % of my GDP to building schools or roads or any of a number of other things, which, you know, I might not do if I had to defend myself.
Vladimir Putin denies knowing who the gunmen are.
Russia gets obstreperous in Ukraine.
But these troops were happy to tell me they were Russian infantry.
Russian. And what happens? The Europeans run around like chickens with their heads cut off, and they wait for the Americans to show up. The president announces that he's going to find another $1 billion in exercise money. So I'm listening for the chorus of Europeans saying, yes, and we will match that. Yes, we will find $500 million. Yes, we will do much of anything. Now, these are rich countries. This is welfare for the rich. Americans should understand they're providing welfare for the rich abroad, and you should scratch your head about that. We keep them as children or as teenagers.
To shirk responsibility is not good. It creates a culture of dependency. Dependency is always dangerous. However, it seems to be pleasurable both to the parent and to the child.
Nobody likes dependency, and no parent wants a kid in their basement at age 30. We want them to grow up and be self-sufficient.
Polls show important shifts in U.S. public opinion. Recently, for the first time since 1960, the majority of Americans agreed it's time to let other countries get along on their own. Polls also reveal a generation gap. Young people say the government should focus on reducing our deficit. Older people believe we should prioritize military spending.
I think what this younger generation has concluded in the two wars that they lived through didn't yield the results in terms of gains for the national interest that made them worthwhile.
I'm not a dove. I supported the Gulf War, and I supported drone strikes, for example. But these wars just seemed, for lack of a better term, so stupid and so unnecessary and so undermining of U.S. security. I couldn't think anybody could possibly think they were a good idea. I hope that this generation of Americans will sort of say, no mas, we don't want to do this anymore.
I think it's very hard if you're a young American to figure, the United States is spending so much on defense and is building hospitals and schools and roads, around the world, and schools and roads and hospitals are in poor shape in the United States, in many parts of the country, and there is real poverty.
They see correctly that much of the rest of the world free rides on us. We're the ones who tend to take an active role, sacrifice our soldiers and our equipment, etc. And so it's a frustration. It's a sense we got to do these things, but damn it, I'm not happy about it.
America spends more on defense than Europe, Russia, and China combined. We outclass the world in military might, but have lost our lead in other arenas. Around the time America adopted the Truman Doctrine, we had the highest per capita income in the world. Today, we rank 17th.
If we could save some money, if we could avoid some wars, right, are there problems at home that we could commit those resources to? Some people would like to return that money to the taxpayer because they think taxes are too high and it's basically corrosive of American liberty. Some people would like to use that money to improve the educational system because they think human capital, better human capital is the key to American success in the out years. Some people look at American infrastructure and scratch their heads and say, this is in such bad shape that it's got to be actually inimical to our economic efficiency.
Beyond the short-term costs are long-term costs. The peak year for disability payments to World War I veterans was 1969. The peak year for World War II veterans was 1986. For Vietnam, the costs are still rising. The current estimate for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is $4 trillion. The financial aftermath strains our budget. With lower defense costs, Europeans can give priority to things like education.
Our schools are not competitive with the people that we're providing military for. The U.S. trails 18 other countries in terms of high school completion, but we're way behind in terms of what kids learn, and this is a real problem. In the past, we've been able to rely on having such a high-skilled labor force, and we are facing a world that is very different, where our competitors are moving ahead of us in fundamental ways.
America's future leaders, in business as well as politics, graduate college deeply in debt.
Education! No! What do we want? Education!
In contrast with students elsewhere.
European students don't pay tuition.
We do not have a case of students getting out of school highly in debt.
I travel all around the country talking with people about this question, and most people want to know, is it time? Is it possible for us to draw back down on our overseas commitments? And there are two sides to the debate, and the side that we hear often the most is that it's too dangerous, that if we don't do this, no one else will.
The United States learned a very hard lesson on September 11th, that the real threats to us were really not necessarily from big powers, but rather from failed states. The terrorists of 9/11, Al-Qaeda, came from Afghanistan, the fifth poorest country in the world.
I do think that the world is fragile. I think that the international system that was set up at the end of World War II is not functioning as well as it should.
If the United States steps back from the historic role we played since World War II, the world will come apart at the seams.
We have to maintain some form of ready forces in a world where time zones have shrunk due to air travel, sea travel, and certainly in an age when a couple of nuts can cause industrial level damage. So what you want to do with strategy is set up shock absorbers so you have the fewest big regrets when the surprise hits, because there will always be surprises, always.
I'm the one in France who said on the evening of 9/11, today we're all Americans. People thought generally that it was a show of solidarity. I meant also we're all targets. And that's really the way I still feel. To me, our world is not stable.
When you're under the kind of pressure that we faced after September 11th, every day after seems like September 12th, you go to work thinking that something's going to pop out of a door, another attack, another spate of violence. Would I like to see Europe in particular spend more on its defense? Absolutely. It's an outrage that the Europeans have allowed their military forces to decline to the level that they have. But I'm also not willing to stake the security of the globe and American security on a hope that they're going to do so. If they don't, then we'll just have to step forward.
But the point is, I don't see who's going to step in and do it. Who's going to do it? So is it fair? No. Great nations pay a price for being great. That's one of them.
But there is growing concern that America is on the wrong track. Some say threats have been exaggerated. Security needs are different from before, and policy should be recalculated in response.
We need to fundamentally rethink the international security architecture over which we've presided now for about 3 generations. Europe seems, by historical standards, quite stable and really not a source of threat to the stability of the security of this country or the stability of the world at large.
War between France and Germany or Britain is simply absolutely inconceivable.
Relations with Russia remain tense. But Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's a smaller country. Today, Germany, France, Britain, and even Italy have bigger economies than Russia.
It's not the only country with nuclear weapons on in Europe. It's certainly not the only country that can build fighter planes. The Russians, on their best day, probably themselves could only put about 10 divisions in the field. They've got problems everywhere.
I expect better of policymakers who say that we live in the most dangerous time in their lifetime or the most dangerous time in world history. That's not true. It feels that way sometimes if you don't make a conscious decision to actually think about where we were 20 years ago or 40 years ago. Or 60 years ago. And I think if we allow those fears to dictate our policy, it will lead to us taking steps and doing things that in retrospect we will regret.
Americans are more likely to be killed by their furniture than they are by a terrorist. They're more likely to be killed by a TV falling on top of them or falling in the bathtub. We focus on the terrible things that happened in Iraq or Syria or elsewhere, and we ignore the reality of the world that we live in, which is one of extraordinary peace and security, extraordinary relative peace and security. It doesn't mean that all wars have ended and there's not still suffering, but the reality is that we've made extraordinary progress. And I think recognizing that reality is really the most effective way to have a better foreign policy.
The question really is, are we overdoing it? Is there more military spending happening than America needs to ensure its safety, and its territorial integrity? Are we spending more? Are we doing more? Right? Now, I believe that we could spend less, do less, and spend those resources on something else.
So why don't we spend less? Has fear gotten the better of us?
Fear serves pretty much the entire national security infrastructure, if you will. It serves politicians, it serves pundits, it serves defense contractors, human rights organizations. I mean, it really runs the gamut. Everybody sort of has an advantage in escalating the sense of fear because it allows us to devote more attention to their issue. Everything in foreign policy discussions in this country drives us to a position of more activity.
American allies are very, very adept at telling the Americans arguments as to why the Americans must do this project. If you don't do it, no one will do this project, and the world will end. Well, the Americans should basically look at them and say, the world will end for us or for you, right? And if the world will end for you, then I actually think that you will do more if you have to do more.
There are also many problems that outside force simply cannot solve. In these cases, military intervention can make things worse.
If we've learned anything from the major interventions that we've made since World War II in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, it's no matter how much military muscle and might we can muster, our ability to really rearrange the political culture and institutions of foreign societies is very, very limited.
The intervention in Iraq, I have to classify that as just a catastrophic foreign policy failure. It's the best military that's ever been fielded in the span of world history. It is Thor's hammer. But the problem that you have then, you see Thor's hammer is there, and then every problem that you look at globally, it's a nail to be dealt with by Thor's hammer. The costs are severe when we are engaged in an intervention that's not well politically informed.
One of the things we know is that politically self-aware groups really rankle at governance by outsiders, and even the impression of governance by outsiders. They just don't like it.
And basically, as I look back over these wars since World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, dare I say Afghanistan, stick Somalia in there somewhere, other expeditions. When America goes to war with murky political end states, then you end up in a situation where you are trying to do something right, but you're not sure if it's the right thing. And suddenly you end up with a situation where the American people say, what are we doing here? And what kind of people are we that we do this sort of thing? If you don't know what it is that you're going to achieve, then don't be surprised that eventually you've wasted treasure, lives, and the moral authority of the United States.
When we discuss threats abroad, often the first argument is that the Americans have to go somewhere and do something, right? People forget that, the United States of America has big oceans to the left and right, and we can put many, many layers of defense between us and trouble, which means that we should think very, very carefully before we go out to try and meet the trouble, to lance the boil, to cauterize the wounds, because it turns out that these kinds of offensive strategies, necessary in some cases, are nevertheless quite fraught and quite expensive.
Where do we stand? 70 years since the start of the Truman Doctrine. Things have changed dramatically. World war no longer threatens. Bombed out countries are now prosperous, and they are peaceful and they are strong. Nations have proliferated. Some of them are really poorly governed. But you can't fix all of their internal problems with outside force. In fact, nobody can but themselves.
Playing umpire comes with risks. Umpires struggle to be impartial.
You missed me safe!
They become targets.
We don't want our umpires to be partisans for one team or the other.
Catcher was in position, you're out of position, you've been out of position the whole game.
Umpires have a limited field of vision. They're not always right. When conflicts arise, it's good to have company and spread out the responsibility. In baseball, umpires back each other up and share the hot spot.
And I think the United States has precisely the same problem in the international sphere, that the easy cases aren't the important ones. It's the hard calls, and that's where we get ourselves into trouble.
We are not the only power. I think we are still the most powerful country in the world, but we are not alone. And it goes back to saying initially that there's nothing in the word indispensable that says alone. The problems that are out there require cooperation from other countries and from international institutions. And the question is how you motivate the others to participate.
If you look back on the last 70 years of American foreign policy, I mean, the most extraordinary thing that America has done has everything to do with the international system that we helped create. We helped create the World Trade Organization, geared toward international peace and security. Liberal democracies have, to a large extent, become the norm. How do we improve that? How do we solidify those gains?
We're aiming for a more complex world in which the function that the United States performed
in the past 70 years, it's going to have to be performed by cooperation among major powers. And they will have to include China and Europe.
Are we spending too much or carrying a heavier share of the burden? We are, but we don't have to. We do not have to. We're simply not doing those things that could inspire leaders to take some of the burden off the Americans. But there are folks out there who will stand by us if we'll just let them.
Here's what we think you should do. We're going to give you the keys to the car, and it's time for you to basically police the neighborhood. And it doesn't seem to be a lot to ask. I talk about a 10-year phenomenon of handing over the keys to the car. And it strikes me to be a fairly conservative glide path to responsibility. It seems to me that in 10 years, we could probably get the Europeans accustomed to running the show for themselves.
We tend to be so self-critical that we forget about our accomplishments, and accomplishments are what you build upon. As Washington and Jefferson understood, it's our economy and our ideas that are the foundation of American liberties, not the gun.
When I was the ambassador in Afghanistan, I had an opportunity to travel down to this village in southern Helmand province where we had a company of about 120 Marines who were fighting very hard. These Pashtun tribal leaders then went on a walk with me around their village, and they pointed out a irrigation system that had been built by USAID, U.S. Development Agency, in the late 50s and 60s. They asked me if I knew some of the Peace Corps workers that were there in the 1960s. When I flew back to Kabul that night, I was unable to sleep, and it came to me. The sad part was that none of those Marines will be remembered. Who was remembered was the development agency decades ago that built that irrigation system. It was the Peace Corps volunteers. If we're going to remain influential and persuasive, we're going to do it through our culture. We're going to do it by setting good examples. We need the sword that the Marines and the Army can draw and have to bring to bear from time to time in a very dangerous world. But don't lose sight of the fact, ever, that the strength of the United States of America is in our political system, and it's having a vibrant economy that helps to persuade others around the world to be with the United States. They set the example. I want to be like them.
I think the policy lead, the American public, agree on one thing. They all want the United States of America to be a secure state so that Americans can go on about their business. The difference is in what they think needs to be done to achieve that. Given the immensely favorable security position that the United States enjoys inherently on this rich and wonderful and productive continent, defended by this fantastic military, it's not so easy to make the case that security problems abroad are major problems for the United States. American people should be asking hard-headed questions. It's perfectly fine to ask the question, what's in it for us?
We honor those who answered the call of their country. They fulfilled the policies laid out by the presidents, Washington and Truman. And the world that they fought for is here. The first and second phases of American history are over. There's no major nation that threatens the peace of the entire world as happened during the Cold War. Yes, there's terrorism, and it's a problem. It's a serious problem, but it's everybody's problem. So the question really becomes, how can we best lead? And good leaders develop new leaders. They inspire them, and they hold them responsible.
The stakes are high, and the time is now. Our founding fathers understood that the world needs umpires. The most stable system is one that everybody is prepared to defend, not just the brave men and women leaving home today or distant shores once again.